Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me?
We can hear you,
Yes.
Professor.
Okay. So, another beautiful day today. We're going to continue on with the muscles. So, up to now, what have you learned? You've learned how, first of all, the histology of the skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle. Then, how does the signal, the action potential, the electrical signal traveling down a motor neuron that carries the information from the central nervous system to the muscle. How does this go about? And the communication between the motor neuron, or the signaling between the motor neuron and the muscle fiber or the muscle cell. Okay, so now then we moved on to the contraction, relaxation of the muscle fiber, how that electrical signal is converted into movement, into tension, into force, and with the use of ATP. So you have chemical energy in the form of ATP that now is being converted to mechanical force, to tension. Okay, and of course, as we describe this, and we discuss this, we're talking all the time about ATP. So ATP is very important, of course, for muscle contraction. And so the muscles have three ways of getting ATP. The ones that you already know and you are familiar with, which is the glycolytic pathway. This pathway occurs outside the mitochondria. And remember, it only produces 2 ATP from one molecule of glucose. And this glycolytic pathway that does not require oxygen, so it's anaerobic, is enough for muscle contraction for about 45 seconds. After 45 seconds, if this would be the only mechanism by which a muscle fiber could get ATP, after 45 seconds, the muscle fiber would be out of ATP, would be fatigued. Then you also know the aerobic pathway, which is, so in the glycolytic pathway, you have glycogen. Remember, glycogen is a polymer of glucose. So many glucose is attached to each other, and it's present. So the glucose is stored in the muscle as glycogen. And in the anaerobic pathway or the glycolytic pathway, you have glycogen converted to glucose, and then glucose goes through several chemical reactions. And the end point is lactic acid. So if you have a lot of glycolysis going on to produce ATP for the muscle fibers, then the pH inside the muscle fibers, now you understand why it becomes acidic, because you have a lot of lactic acid being generated. And this is in the absence of oxygen, anaerobic condition. Okay, now the anaerobic system, where from one glucose you get 36 to 38 ATPs, but you need oxygen, so it's a very efficient system. So you can see that this mechanism of producing ATP is so efficient that you can go on for more than 100 seconds. So it's a chronic way of producing ATP. It's very efficient because you have so much ATP being produced. Okay, so the muscles have a third way of producing, a third mechanism for producing ATP, and that's the phosphagen system. This phosphagen system relies on an amino acid analog, which is creatine, and creatine is phosphorylated, so it's phosphocreatine, and it's known as the phosphagen system. So the phosphagen system produces ATP just for about 30 seconds. So it's even less efficient than the glycolysis. So if the muscle fiber would rely only on the phosphagen system, then there would be ATP just for 30 seconds, to provide ATP for 30 seconds of muscle contraction. So you have these three systems that are mechanisms that are used by the muscle fibers to produce ATP. And also neurons have these three systems. So there's the only cells in our body that have these three mechanisms of producing ATP. All the others rely on glycolysis and aerobic or anaerobic phosphorylation. So it's only muscles and neurons that have the phosphagen system in addition. Okay, so you see here this cartoon, this person is running for several seconds. So from the beginning, what is the first source of ATP that is being used by the muscle fibers? It's the phosphagen system. So it's good for about 10 seconds. After 10 seconds, that ATP runs out, so you need to bring up the glycolytic system, and it goes on for maybe 30 more seconds, and then it runs out. Finally, you have the aerobic system, which is very efficient and allows to do exercise or run for much longer time. But then at the end, when you might run out of oxygen and you have to stop and you're huffing and puffing. And this is the stage at the end of the exercise or at a certain point of the exercise where you run into oxygen depth. So you don't have enough oxygen. So you have to breathe fast to bring more oxygen into the body to reestablish all these systems, especially the aerobic system that requires oxygen, but also the phosphagen system also requires oxygen. So this sort of tells you the timeline of a muscle fiber when you're doing exercise. So it relies on the production of ATP through these three different systems. So let's look, what is the phosphagen system that I've been talking about? So it produces ATP for a very short while, so like a 100-meter dash, that's very fast race, only running 100 meters. So what happens? You have this amino acid analog, creatine, that you can get from diet or from, can be synthesized in the liver, kidney, or pancreas. So the pH is lowered, right? When you have too much lactic acid, then the pH is acidic, it's lower. And this is one of the reasons why you get sore muscles. It's because of the pH, the low pH inside the muscle fiber. Okay, so here you have the creatine phosphate. Creatine is an amino acid analog, but it's an amino acid that is not used to make proteins. So it has a phosphate group, so creatine phosphate. That's why the name phosphagen system. And there's this enzyme known as a creatine kinase. So a kinase is an enzyme that can remove one phosphate group from one molecule and donate it to ATP or to another molecule. So it transfers phosphate groups. That's a kinase. That's a general definition of a kinase. Here, we call this protein or this enzyme creatine kinase because what does it do? It transfers a phosphate group from creatine to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to make ATP. So here you see that there's no glucose being used. It's an amino acid. An amino acid that's phosphorylated, it's phosphate creatine, creatine phosphate. This enzyme removes the phosphate group and donates to ADP, transfers it to ADP to form ATP. So you have one reaction. We have one molecule of creatine phosphate gives rise to one molecule of ATP. So it's very short-lived, and it produces ATP for to support muscle activity for a very short time. Okay, in addition, in the phosphagen system, there's another kinase. So it takes the phosphate from creatine. Exactly. It takes the phosphate from the creatine and it gives it to ADP to make ATP, adenosine diphosphate to adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so there's another kinase. Now it's called myokinase. Myo means in the muscle, myokinase. So what does this kinase do? It removes the phosphate group from ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and gives it to another adenosine phosphate to make ATP. So now the ADP becomes adenosine monophosphate. So these two kinases work in combination to produce ATP. The creatine kinase from creatine phosphate, that's the donor of the phosphate group. And here the myokinase, the donor is ADP.
So, Professor, to
Yes,
reiterate on it, so myokinase pretty much grabs the phosphate from ADP and transfers it to another ADP to make ATP.
exactly,
Okay,
exactly.
and that's only prevalent in the in muscle cells, right?
Right. When you see this suffix,
Myo is muscle.
myo, it's muscle. Exactly. You got
Thank
it. So this, in a nutshell, is the phosphagen system. And remember, this part is only present in muscles and neurons. This part just in muscles. Okay, so let's say when you're at rest, what happens? So you've been doing a lot of exercises, doing a lot of ATP, and now you're resting. So what happens? So you have to generate a reserve of mechanisms to produce ATP. So the creatine that was used, that resulted from the action of the creatine kinase, is going to be now phosphorylated again. So a phosphate group is going to be added to creatine while you're resting so that it becomes phosphocreatine. So when you are resting, you reestablish the source of the phosphagen system, the creatine phosphocreatine. So did I say that clearly? So
you.
during
Professor, I have a
resting,
question.
yes,
So this is under lecture 15, oxygen consumption, because it's a little different.
yes. So we didn't discuss this in the last lecture, so I added the notes are updated with this material in these slides because we didn't discuss this in the last lecture, so I transferred it to today. Okay. So if you go to today's, I updated yesterday, I uploaded yesterday. Okay, so here we are. So now during resting, we have a higher level of this phosphocreatine. And when we are doing exercise and so on, the phosphocreatine is depleted because the phosphate group is added to ADP to make ATP. So this ATP is used for what? So remember, you have a lot of ATP being used by the myosin ATPase. Remember, that's required to make the cross bridges between myosin and actin. Then you have calcium ATPases. This is a calcium channel that, or a pump, I should say it's a pump that removes calcium from the cytoplasm back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum to allow for relaxation to occur. And then you have, remember, 40% of oxygen is used by this sodium potassium ATPase, or 40% of the ATP is used for the function of this sodium potassium pump, not oxygen. I mean, 40% of the ATP that's produced in the body is used by this pump, sodium potassium ATPase. So that's why you need so much ATP for muscle contraction. Okay. So this is the anaerobic pathway. We talked about the phosphagen pathway, now the anaerobic pathway or mechanism. So you have glucose coming from glycogen, and then in the cytoplasm, the glucose goes through many different, a cascade of reactions, where the output is pyruvic acid. The end step is pyruvic acid. And you get 2 ATPs from one molecule of glucose. And there's no oxygen required here. That's why the oxygen is crossed out. So now this pyruvic acid, which is present in the cytoplasm, remember, this all is occurring in the cytoplasm. Now this pyruvic acid, if there's no oxygen, it's converted into lactic acid. And then lactic acid is released into the blood and goes back to the liver, where it is converted to glucose. So you have here continuously glucose is being replenished. But if there's no oxygen, then the lactic acid can accumulate in the muscle fiber and decrease the pH. So it becomes more acidic, and that can lead to soreness. So here you have 2 ATPs being produced from one molecule of glucose, and you have lactic acid, and the energy that is provided by this mechanism can allow the muscle fiber to be active for 30 to 60 seconds. Did I hear a question? Just to clarify, oh, wait a minute, let's see. So after the lactic acid, is generated and it's released to the blood, it has to be converted back to glucose and glycogen, and that occurs in the liver. So the blood carries this lactic acid to the liver, and that's where the lactic acid then is recycled back into glycogen and glucose. So there's this recycling mechanism. So just to clarify, are these slides from the previous lecture that we didn't go over? So these slides now are on lecture 15. I updated lecture 15. Yes, they were on lecture 14, but we didn't cover them. So I removed them from lecture 14 and added them to lecture 15. Okay, so all this now is in lecture 15. Okay, question. Does the blood pH increase from lactic acid? Remember, lactic acid is an acid, so the pH decreases, okay? And that's why you have that buffering system. Remember when we were talking about chemistry and buffers, and we had the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer? So that's why it's important, because this lactic acid, yes, will make the blood pH acidic, and that's why you need a buffer. So during what circumstances does lactic acid accumulate? Well, just think about it. If you don't have enough oxygen, if you run out of oxygen, then because you will see the next step, if there's oxygen, the pyruvic acid bypasses lactic acid and the pyruvic acid goes into mitochondria. If there's oxygen, so you'll get much, much less lactic acid. But if there's not enough oxygen, then the pyruvic acid will be converted to lactic acid. So if you're over-exercising and there's not enough oxygen running through the blood to provide for the aerobic mechanism, then you have a lot of lactic acid being accumulating in the muscle fiber. Yes, lecture 15 is uploaded. So does anyone see the lecture 15 uploaded?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. Thank you for confirming. And with these slides, correct? Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. You have to click, that's true, that's right. So the bright space only goes up to lecture 14, and then there's a little label that say more. So you click on more and you will go to lecture 15. Thank you. Yes, the notes are also updated. Okay, so let's continue. Now we go to the aerobic, right? So remember the pyruvic acid. Here you don't see lactic acid because now we have oxygen. So in the presence of oxygen, so here you have oxygen, right? This part doesn't require oxygen, but now here you need oxygen. So the pyruvic acid enters the mitochondria, and through the aerobic respiration, you get a lot, because this is a cycle. We call it one of the terms that we use to refer to all the reactions that go on into the mitochondria, which is a cycle. It's called the Krebs cycle. So it goes around and around and around. And from one molecule of glucose, you can get 36 ATP in skeletal muscle and 38 ATP in cardiac muscle. So you see, because of mitochondria, this cycle that goes around and around and around and around, you get many more ATPs. And from the mitochondria, what you get from these reactions that produce the ATP, you end up with water and carbon dioxide. And you have to get rid of carbon dioxide, right? Through respiration. Okay, now here you have a direct way of getting glucose to give rise of ATP. But suppose that you go on a carbohydrate-free diet, right? So you're not taking carbohydrates, you're not taking things with sugar. So what does the body do? What's the next preferred source to make ATP? Fatty acids. And that's why a low carbohydrate diet can lead to loss of weight, because now you don't have enough carbohydrates to go through this cascade. Now you use fatty acids instead that are fed into the mitochondria. And if there's no carbohydrates and no fatty acids, then amino acids can be used by the mitochondria to produce ATP. Okay, so oxygen use is required to produce 36 ATP per glucose. The final product is carbon dioxide and water. And this can produce ATP, can give muscle enough ATP to go on for hours. What happens when you start eating the carbohydrates again? Well, if you overeat carbohydrates and don't watch the diet, you gain weight again. It all depends on how much, how many calories. The calorie count is the most important. Okay, so here you have the three different mechanisms that the muscle uses, the muscle fibers equals muscle cells, use to produce ATP. Okay, so now let's go to oxygen consumption. So another way that the muscle fiber developed to be more efficient to produce ATP. So it needs a lot of oxygen to produce all those large amounts of ATP, large concentrations of ATP. So oxygen in all cells, oxygen is carried in the blood by the hemoglobin, right? The hemoglobin is located in the red blood cells that are transported in the blood vessels. So the red blood cells essentially are made up, they lose all the organelles once they are mature, and they contain hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a complex molecule. Remember sickle cell anemia, the mutation in hemoglobin? So it has four polypeptides. So we call it, it's a tetrameric oxygen carrier protein. Tetra means four. So it's four peptides that come together to form hemoglobin. But amazingly, the muscle has another way, another protein that can bind oxygen, and that's known as myoglobin. And this is only present in muscles. So in the muscle cells are sort of reddish. Why do they have that color? Because they have myoglobin. Oh, how many? How many molecules of ATP do you use a day? Well, if depends, if you're in good shape, in very good shape, and do a lot of exercises, you use many, many more molecules of ATP than if someone is sitting all day and not doing exercise. So it varies. There's no one number. Okay, so here you have another mechanism that the muscle cells developed to make the production of ATP more efficient, so that you have more oxygen in those muscle fibers, because you have another molecule that binds oxygen, and that's myoglobin. So myoglobin is sort of a simple, a molecule that's a simple, a simpler hemoglobin, because it only has one peptide. It's only one peptide. Would cutting out carbs affect your ATP levels? Well, it's all a question of how much. If you can live, you can function with a low carb diet, and actually this is supposed to increase longevity. So there's a lot of interesting theories out there about low carb diets. So anyway, it could be a whole lecture, but it's more for nutrition. So those of you that are interested. Okay, so another thing that I should point out, this is a good question. So when the fatty acids are used by the mitochondria to make ATP, you get many more ATP molecules. Why? Because remember, fatty acids are made up of these, they're attached. You have many triglycerides, right? They're made up of many fatty acids. So you have the fatty acids are made up of many carbons, chains of carbons, and those are fed into the mitochondria, and they produce many more ATP molecules. Anyway, I don't want to get too much into this. So those athletes who increase their hemoglobin for long endurance, does that also means it simultaneously increases the myoglobin as well? Well, hemoglobin is in the red blood cells. Myoglobin is in the muscle fibers. So two different mechanisms, right? But you can, myoglobin is a protein, so its levels is genetically determined. So it has promoters that induce the expression of the gene. So there are many factors that can lead to the expression, to the increase in myoglobin production. But hemoglobin, the levels of hemoglobin usually are increased by increasing the number of red blood cells. And I will show you, I will discuss this very shortly. So to answer your question directly, to increase hemoglobin does not necessarily increase myoglobin, because hemoglobin is in the red blood cells, myoglobin is in the muscle fibers, and their regulation, the regulation of the levels of each of these two proteins is very different. Here it's at the gene level, it's the transcription, translation, the expression of myoglobin is regulated within the muscle fiber. Here you can regulate the amount of hemoglobin by increasing or decreasing the number of red blood cells. Yes, correlation, but no causation. Sort of. Yes, well put. Okay, so myoglobin is the only protein that's only present in muscle cells. Okay, so now how can we sort of define that the person is in good shape? One of the parameters or factors is how much oxygen a person can remove from the air and deliver it to the body per minute per kilogram of body weight. So this is a measurement that you can go through and assess in an individual. How many milliliters of oxygen an individual can remove from the air that is breathing and per minute per kilogram of body weight, and that oxygen to be delivered throughout the cells. And here, what is important, of course, is to the muscle fibers. So you'll see that this depends on many different factors. The number of red blood cells, the type of muscle fiber, and so on and so forth. And the heart condition. So this is the VO2 max, is a number that reflects how an individual, the shape of the individual, not the shape in terms of body shape, but if the individual is in good athletic shape. So, and for around a 20 years old individual, the number, the VO2 max, is 35 to 48 milliliters of oxygen removed per minute per kilogram of body weight. Now, someone that is highly trained, that does, for example, cardiovascular exercises and so on, that number can double, 70 to 80 milliliters of oxygen. So how is this determined and how is it regulated, this VO2 max? Well, it can be genetically determined. It's many proteins that can influence the amount of oxygen that's binding to hemoglobin and so on. It increases with appropriate training. What is the appropriate training here? Is cardiovascular. So cardiovascular, that means that you're making exercises that increase the fitness of the heart. Remember that the heart is also a muscle, cardiac muscle. So if you do exercises that improve the function of the cardiac muscle, then the pumping, contraction, and relaxation of the cardiac muscle can be improved so that you have more blood being released each time the muscle contracts. So another factor is altitude training. We talked about this some lectures ago. So altitude training relates to how much oxygen is in the atmosphere. So if you are at high altitudes, there's less oxygen than if you are at sea level. So the body, there's a feedback mechanism, if you remember. So there's this enzyme, erythropoietin, that is produced by the kidneys. It's a hormone produced by the kidneys. And what does it do? Its target is to increase the number of red blood cells when the oxygen density goes down. So the oxygen density is the trigger, the receptors on the kidney that are activated by lower levels of oxygen, and now erythropoietin is produced and acts where? Remember, in the blood stem cells that are located within the trabecula in the spongy bones, right? So erythropoietin has to go there and increase the production of red blood cells. So you have low oxygen activating erythropoietin in the kidney. Erythropoietin travels through the blood to the bone, to the bone marrow, and there's an increase in red blood cells production. Oh, we're here. Okay. So then the other factor is the efficiency of the heart, the cardiac output. So if you don't, the heart doesn't have, so usually the heartbeat, the normal person is around 60, sometimes 70 beats per minute. But if you're really, really in shape, it can go down to 40 beats per minute. So that means that the heart only needs to pump 40 times to release enough blood to provide oxygen. So does this also have something to do with having a large spleen? No. The spleen is an organ that plays a role in the immune system. You will study that in the spring. Okay. Isn't normal heart rate between 60 to 100? No, 100 is very high. 100 would be considered something like tachycardia, which means the heart is beating too much, too fast. It's between 60, 70. Wouldn't it be unhealthy to have lower heart rate? Well, yes, if the muscle is not strong enough. But now think about if the muscle is, the cardiac muscle is so strong that it only needs, each time it pumps as much blood, because what you want is the blood to be pumped so that the red blood cells carry oxygen. So if each contraction of the cardiac muscle is much, much more efficient because the muscle is stronger. So you don't need so many contractions to release the same amount of blood. So let's say that 10 times in a normal person, 10 times the muscle, the heart contracts, you release 10 milliliters of blood. But in someone that the cardiac muscle is very strong, to release those 10 milliliters of blood, you only need to pump 40 times instead of 60 times. So that's I hope that you understand that. But if the cardiac muscle is very weak and it's only beating at 40 times per minute, that's called bradykinesia. That means it's not good. It's not delivering enough blood. It's not pumping enough blood. Okay? People have lower resting heart rate. Exactly. Okay, doping. I'm going to explain that. Okay? Okay, so I don't know, some of you might be very young to never heard of Lance Armstrong. Lance Armstrong is an American athlete. Oh my gosh. That won 7 bicycle races that are the most famous in France, right? He won 7 times the Tour de France, which is a bicycle race around France. 7 times. That is the hardest bicycle race in the world. So he won 7 times, and he had brain tumor at one time. Okay. And Lance claimed that he never doped. So his VO2 max was 83.8. Remember, the 20-year-old average shape, 48 milliliters. Here you have 83.8 milliliters per minute per kilogram. So what did Lance Armstrong do? So he said he never took erythropoietin, he never took any blood chemicals and so on. But what did he do? So he had doctors. He would go to a hotel room. Doctors would go there and would take blood from him and would store his red blood cells in the freezer. So from time to time, he would have blood removed, the red blood cells purified from the rest of the blood, and they were frozen so that they were still active, they were viable. So the day before the races, the different stages of the race, he would be injected with his own red blood cells. So of course, this could not be detected by chemical tests. Erythropoietin can be detected, right? But not the number of red blood cells that cannot be detected. So he could do this many, many times and helped him win the 7 races. Eventually, this was discovered because some of the other athletes in the same team, in Lance's team, they spoke about this. And of course, the trophies were all removed. And it was really unnecessary. What he did was really unnecessary. So he cheated, and that's not good. So I hope cheating does not pay. Eventually, you will be discovered. Remember this for the exam, because in last exam, our first exam, there were still some students that cheated. They were looking at their phones. I know. The proctors told me. So don't do this. If you are caught this time, it's not going to be good. Anyway, forget about what I said now because we're concentrating on physiology. And Lance Armstrong, that unfortunately was really not a good person. And that's what doping means. Doping means taking either chemicals or using strategies that give the athlete an advance over the others that are competing in the same race. It's illegal. Exactly. It's cheating. You got it. Not a good thing. Okay. So now, us humans are very creative. So we have this knowledge that if you train at high altitudes, like in Mexico or in high Colorado, the high mountains, when there's low oxygen, then you increase the number of red blood cells, then your race is at sea level, so you already have an advantage because you have now more red blood cells. But this is perfectly fine because it wasn't artificially injected just before the race started. Okay, but can one mimic the effect of training at high altitude? Yes. So there's these training masks that were developed. Maybe if you go to the gym, you might see someone wearing these. And what they do is they decrease the amount of oxygen that the person or air that the person is taking in. So it's like training at high altitude without having to go to Colorado or any other mountain. So it's creative. Okay, so to increase the maximum oxygen uptake. So the oxygen, remember, is required for aerobic production of ATP. So what are the mechanisms that increase the chances of, or the VO2 max? So endurance training or cardiovascular training, this is the way to increase the amount of oxygen that an individual can take from the air. So cardiovascular training, what does it do? It increases the blood supply to the body. So it makes the heart pump stronger. So each time the heart pumps, there's more blood coming out. So there's more blood circulating, more red blood cells circulating, more oxygen being delivered to the muscles. So that's the whole idea of cardiovascular training. This kind of exercise does not increase muscle size. So this cardiovascular training uses ATP produced by the aerobic mechanism. It uses isotonic contractions. So if you remember, what are isotonic contractions? Isotonic contractions, that means that the weight is always the same. It's the tension, the force that changes. You mean that, the size that changes. The force is the same because it's the weight of the body. It doesn't change while you're running. But the size of the muscles changes, contracting, relaxing as you're running or doing exercises. So this type of exercise is jogging, aerobic dancing, and so on. So not using weights. You're just improving the function of the heart. How come endurance exercise will raise your heart rate and that is good for it, but having heart rate is not okay generally? How come endurance exercise will raise your heart rate and that, no, it doesn't raise the heart rate, it decreases the heart rate. Because remember, the heart becomes more efficient, so it doesn't have to pump so many times to release blood, the same amount of blood. So a high heart rate is not good, okay? So these aerobic, if it doesn't generally lower, yes, it doesn't, it generally lowers it, that's correct. I was wondering what, like an anxiety attack will raise your heart rate. Isn't that like endurance training? That's so funny. So what you're saying is that we all should be anxious all the time so that we are fit. No, because anxiety increases the heart rate in a different way. It's the neurons, the central nervous system, that is activating the heartbeat, but it has nothing to do with the function of the heart. So it does not alter the effectiveness of the cardiac muscle. It doesn't affect the size and the strength of the heart. It just makes it beat faster because that's regulated by the sympathetic nervous system. We will understand that. So anxiety does not increase the performance of the heart. It just increases the heart rate, okay? So let's see. Okay, so cortisol is released too, which is bad in the organs long term. Cortisol is released when you work out as well. Okay, but that's different anyway, because remember, cortisol, one of its functions is to prevent inflammation. So it's a good thing. Anyway, so there's a lot of interest here. You have very good questions. Okay, so this kind of cardiovascular training its function is to improve the heartbeat, the function of the heart. Its aim. So the aim of endurance training is to improve the function of the heart muscle, the heart muscle. Here, strength training what it does, it increases the size of the muscle. So it increases the production of muscle proteins. So that means that the muscle fiber is going to increase in size. It doesn't increase the number of muscle fibers. It increases the size of muscle fibers because there's more myofibers, more myofilaments. So this type of exercise relies on glycolysis, on anaerobic training, because you're not really moving. So the muscles are not changing in size. This is isometric contractions. So you're holding on to a very heavy load for some time. So the muscle size doesn't change. Only the force that the muscle is exerting changes. So it's like, remember when you push against a wall, the size of the muscle doesn't change, but the tension changes. So this is strength training, and it relies on isometric contractions. So the size of the muscle doesn't change, but the force does. And it relies on anaerobic ATP production. Okay, so you have these two types of exercises, and you know what the aim is, the goal is. And there's also a third type of exercise, which is flexibility, which is very, very important for the ligaments. You want to prevent the ligaments from rupturing. So you want to preserve their elasticity. Like, I can barely touch my shoulder. I should do more exercises for my ligaments to allow me to move my neck. Okay, so here you have the endurance to improve cardiovascular, to improve heart function, strength to improve the size, increase the size of the muscle fibers, and flexibility targets the ligaments. Okay, wouldn't it need isotonic contractions because the movement for weight-bearing training involves multiple repeats? Okay, so what we are doing here, this is when the weight is stationary, okay? So you're not moving the muscles. It's not like doing push-ups or doing this kind of thing. You're stationary, holding on to the weight. That's what I'm referring to here. So there's no, the muscles don't contract or extend. The size remains the same. Okay, so here, the endurance training, as I was telling you, if you get in shape, the heart beat can go down by 15 to 20 beats, going down to 40 beats per minute instead of 60 beats per minute. And here the idea is that the volume of blood that is released by the heart beating 60 times, now if you are in very good shape, that same amount of blood is going to be released by the heart by only beating 40 times. So that's the big difference. So the stroke volume, so that means, what is the stroke volume? So when the heart contracts, you have a certain amount of blood that is released. That's the volume. So if the heart is in very good shape and the heart muscle is in very strong, then when it contracts, it's going to release more blood than if it's weak. Cardiac output increases during maximal effort. Okay, heart volume and heart rate increases. So these are some of the benefits of endurance exercise. And we should all exercise for at least 30 minutes a day. That would be, it's recommended by the American College of Sports Medicine and Centers for Disease Control. A very, very good recommendation. So not exercising is worse for your health than smoking, diabetes, heart disease, and some studies reveal. So exercising can prevent osteoporosis, can prevent heart attacks, can prevent so many other conditions. So it's very, very advisable. Okay, So we go through all this, the muscles are moving, you're running, you're doing exercise. Certain point, you're out of breath. You're huffing and puffing. So that means you have to replenish the oxygen in your body. And that's called the recovery oxygen consumption or oxygen depth. You used so much oxygen in the aerobic production of ATP that now you run out of oxygen. You have to replenish. You need oxygen to convert lactic acid into glycogen. This occurs in the liver. Remember, lactic acid is produced in the muscle fiber, then it's released into the blood, it goes to the liver, and is used to make up glycogen. So you need oxygen to restore creatine phosphate, the phosphagen system. Replenish oxygen in myoglobin. And also, when you're exercising, the body temperature increases, and this increasing temperature will increase the, the rate of chemical reactions. Many of these chemical reactions also use oxygen and are used to make ATP. So you need oxygen after doing this exercise and you're out of breath. You need oxygen for all these reactions and conditions. So muscle fatigue, not enough ATP. And also, there's pain because of the acidity, the production of too much lactic acid, and also all those proteins that we discussed, myosin, actin, titin, troponin, tropomyosin, all these, during all this exercise, they get damaged, and this can also lead to muscle soreness. Okay, so now let's move on. You've asked a lot of good questions. Now, let's move on to types of muscle fibers. Not all muscle fibers are the same. So how can they differ? They differ in color. So if you go to the supermarket and you look at the chicken, right? The breasts are white meat, the legs are dark meat. I'm sure you are aware of this. So what is the difference? Because the dark meat of the chicken, those muscles that are in the legs, are much stronger. They don't tire as much. And why do they have that dark color? Look here. They have a lot of myoglobin. So it's the myoglobin that gives that dark color to the legs of the chicken. So these muscle fibers that are in the legs, they use the aerobic mechanism of ATP production. That's why there's more myoglobin, there's more oxygen, so this mechanism is improved, and therefore the legs don't tire as much. So these muscle fibers that are rich in myoglobin, they don't tire, they don't fatigue as much. Now, the breasts of the chicken, they're white. They have much less myoglobin. It doesn't mean that they don't have any myoglobin. They have myoglobin, but at much lower concentrations. And their way of producing, the major mechanism to produce ATP is through glycolysis. So they fatigue very quickly. And you can do this also in your body. If you have your arms like this, stretched out, you'll see that they fatigue much quicker than your legs and if you're running. So like right now, my arm muscles are almost dying. I'm tired, I'm fatigued, but the legs, you can keep going. Why? Because the muscles in the arms are mostly white. The fibers have less myoglobin. Okay, so the muscle fibers can also differ in diameter. So some have more myofibrils. Remember, myofibrils are those cylinders, right? That contain the thick and thin filaments inside the muscle fiber. They have more mitochondria, more sarcoplasmic reticulum. So more sarcoplasmic reticulum, more calcium. So if exercise more, would it help The arms hold up longer. Yes, you can strengthen the arm muscles. You see that people that can increase the size of the arm muscles a lot by exercises, yes. And then you will get less tired. Mine are very weak, I can tell. And they differ in contraction velocity and resistance to fatigue. Okay, so here you have a picture of two major types of muscle fibers that we have in our body. There are some that are intermediate, but let's see the ones that are extreme. So type 1 muscle fibers, they are fatigue resistant. Why? Because they have lots of myoglobin, and therefore they can use aerobic production of ATP. So that means that they don't run out of ATP because ATP is produced in large amounts. So they are fatigue resistant, but they contract slowly. So these type 1, they're known as slow twitch fibers. The twitch, remember, is the contraction relaxation of one muscle fiber. So some muscles in your body that are made up of type 1 muscle fibers. Okay, let's say all muscles have the 3 types of muscle fibers, all of them. But some have more of type 1 or more of type 2 or more intermediate. So the ratio differs, but they all have the same, the 3 types of muscle fibers. So the neck muscles and the soleus in the leg, they have type 1, mostly type 1 muscle fibers. And you see that they have smaller diameter. And they are darker in color because they have high levels of myoglobin. Type 2 muscle fibers, they fatigue easily because they have low levels of myoglobin, so they have to rely on glycolysis. So they're oxidative or glycolytic, but they're very powerful. They have large diameters, so that means that they have a lot of myofibrils. Some of the muscles that have mostly type 2 fibers are the gastrocnemius, which is also located in the leg, and the arm muscles. So you see here that all muscles are not alike, and they change in color depending on how much myoglobin is there, and they rely either on glycolysis or aerobic phosphorylation. Okay, so here you see, I told you about the muscles in the chicken, and here you see the different properties of fast, slow, and intermediate muscle fibers. So muscle 2B, they're fast, glycolytic. These are the ones that rely on anaerobic respiration, and they fatigue easily. The slow, they are smaller diameter, and they have high levels of myoglobin. So they don't fatigue, but they contract slowly. And then you have the ones in between. Okay, so I told you that most muscles contain the 3 different types of muscle fibers. If you're doing exercises for weight lifting, you're going to increase the number of fast glycolytic fibers. So those fibers that need very little oxygen, that are anaerobic, use glycolysis to make ATP. Marathon runners, they need fibers that make ATP depending on oxygen and the aerobic mechanism of making ATP. So runners, they will increase the number of slow oxidative fibers. So you can see here marathon runners, swimmers, sprinters, and so on. The ratio of slow versus fast muscle fibers present in these athletes. Okay, this is very, very interesting. After we are 1 year old after birth, We only change the size, the size of the muscles changes, depends on the size of the muscle fibers and not on the number of muscle fibers. There's always some increase because we have those satellite cells that can provide for more muscle fibers, but usually the number of muscle fibers doesn't change. Okay, so can you increase the size of the muscle fibers? So here you can look at this chart showing the difference between genetic men and genetic women in types of muscle fibers that are preponderant. So what do anabolic steroids do? They increase the number of muscle cells by increasing satellite cell numbers. Remember, satellite cells are the cells that are the precursor of skeletal muscle fibers. But taking anabolic steroids is not a good thing because it has a lot of side effects, as shown here. Hair loss, acne, kidney problems, and so on and so forth. So anabolic steroids can cause severe problems and long-lasting, can lead to early heart attacks, strokes, liver tumors, kidney failure, psychiatric problems. So, it all depends. It's voluntary, whatever an individual wants. So what about a person who does both weight lifting and running? How would the ratio change? Well, you figure it out. You would increase both, right? The number of type 1. So you would increase the number of fast glycolytic fibers and the number of slow. So you would be in excellent shape. Which type of muscle fiber would increase more? Depending on if you would do more lifting, weightlifting, or more running, right? So there's no optimal way of calculating which number of muscle fibers would increase more. It depends on what type of exercise you do and how frequently you do that type of exercise. Okay, so now we spend a lot of time on skeletal muscle. Let's move now to cardiac muscles. So here's the heart. We talked about the heart and how important cardiovascular exercises are to keep in shape and to prevent disease. So 99% of the cells in the heart are cardiomyocytes, or cells like these shown here that will contract and relax in response to a stimulus. So they only do mechanical work. So like the skeletal muscle, they'll contract and relax. So 99% of the cells in the heart are cardiomyocytes. The 1% of the cells, they can generate an electrical signal spontaneously. So they are modified cardiomyocytes. They're known as the pacemakers. You see here these cells. So if you would put these cells in culture, they would start pumping. They will start contracting and relaxing autonomically. You don't need to activate. You don't need to have a signal. You don't need to stimulate them like these. These you need to stimulate them for them to contract and relax. Here they generate an electrical signal that is going to regulate the muscle contraction of these cells. Then the heart has other types of cells. Yes. So if you have tachycardia, bradycardia, arrhythmia, which is what you are referring, arrhythmia, that means a change in the abnormal heartbeat. Yes, it's the pacemaker that is not working properly. Many people, many times, patients when the pacemaker is not working properly, they use an electrical pacemaker that has a battery and that substitutes for these endogenous pacemakers. Okay, so here you see the 1% of cells that generates an electrical signal. They are located in the sinoatrial node that sends the signal to the atrioventricular node. So the name indicates where they are located. And then the signal goes to the Purkinje fibers that you see cover the ventricles. And then when the signal is transmitted, then the other muscle fibers will respond mechanically. They will contract and relax. So the pacemaker is essential. And the pacemaker starts working spontaneously in the embryonic stage. So you see here an artificial pacemaker that you put some batteries, and its goal is to substitute for the endogenous pacemaker of the individual, and it's not working properly, and it's lost its ability to generate the electrical signal that will stimulate the mechanical cardiomyocytes. Okay, so here, what you are measuring in an EKG, an electrocardiogram, is this electrical signal that developed by the pacemaker. So you see here the P wave is the atrial contraction, QRS, the ventricle contraction, and T and U, the ventricle repolarization. So you need to repolarize so that the ventricles will fill up again with blood. So what you're measuring in EKG is the pacemaker, the electrical signal developed by the pacemaker. Okay, so we went over in great detail in the histology of the cardiac muscle cells, that they are striated, they are branched, they only have one nucleus, and they have these very important structures that are located in the intercalated discs. The intercalated discs are the areas, the surface, where one cardiac myocyte meets another one. So they have the gap junctions, which are these channels that are made up of proteins known as connexins, and there's a channel inside, or a pore. So this channel allows for ions, sodium and potassium, to move from one cell to another. And then there's the desmosomes. The desmosomes are made up of proteins that allow the cardiomyocytes to be attached to each other. You can think about them like Velcro, right? So they attach, they link the cardiomyocytes to each other in this very strong manner. So here you see the effect of the gap junctions, and you'll see why these are important. So these are channels. You see this is a needle that released a fluorescent dye, and it's going to be distributed throughout the whole heart, but you're only releasing into one spot. And because of these gap junctions, allow for communication among the cardiomyocytes. And here you have an electron micrograph of a desmosome. You see all these proteins that act as Velcro to when there's cardiomuscle the contraction or relaxation, the cells don't separate. Okay, so what happens? What is the mechanism? Remember, we went through this to the skeletal muscle. How does the excitation, how is it converted into contraction? So you have the signal that is generated, causing depolarization of the plasma membrane. Now you have the sodium, the voltage, the opening of the voltage gated ion channels. Let's go back to this electrophysiology. So now you have the sodium gated ion channels opening, and you have the propagation of the action potential. Now what happens at the heart, cardiomyocyte, you have these calcium channels that are also voltage gated ion channels. that allow calcium to come in. So what happens here, what is interesting, that is different from the skeletal muscle, is the skeletal muscle, the calcium comes only from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So you have that signal that travels down the T-tubule, and it sends a signal to the calcium channels on the sarcoplasmic reticulum. They open, and calcium goes into the cytoplasm. Here, you have two sources of calcium. You still have the signal that reaches the sarcoplasmic reticulum and allows calcium to move out into the cytoplasm. But at the membrane, there's also these calcium channels that allow calcium to come into the cardiomyocyte. So immediately, you could ask the question, why is it that the cardiomyocytes, just like the smooth muscle, need so much calcium? You have calcium coming from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and you have calcium coming from the extracellular fluid directly into the cytoplasm. So here you have calcium coming into the cell through these voltage-gated calcium channels, and you have calcium coming into the cytoplasm from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Why is this? Because the twitch, the cycle of contraction and relaxation is much longer. So there's more calcium is needed to maintain the cell in a contraction mode. Okay, so here you see the sodium potassium channels at the sarcolemma. And now you see that this change in voltage that is propagated along the plasma, the sarcolemma, induces the opening of this calcium channel. So there's calcium coming from the extracellular fluid directly into the cytoplasm. And now you have also more calcium here being released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So there's more calcium available in the cardiomyocyte to act on the troponin, tropomyosin, myosin, and actin cycle. So another thing that is interesting, so you have this difference. In skeletal muscle, you have one source of calcium that comes from the sarcoplasmic reticulum for the cytoplasm of the cell. And in cardiomyocytes, the calcium comes from the extracellular fluid and also from this sarcoplasmic reticulum. But what is another difference? Another difference is this is a skeletal muscle fiber. Remember, this is the motor end plate. And you have the signal coming from the motor neuron, and the neurotransmitter is released, crosses the synaptic cleft, and binds to the acetylcholine receptors. And this is what initiates the wave of action potential that travels along the sarcolemma. Now here, this is in the cardiac muscle. So you have here a pacemaker cell, right? That generates the signal. Remember, this is that 1% of cardiomyocytes in the heart. So they generate this electrical signal automatically, and they transmit it to the cardiac muscle. But now, because there are gap junctions, that sodium and potassium changes that occur in the sarcolemma of the skeletal muscle, they only go in and out through channels. Here, the sodium and potassium are transmitted from one cardiomyocyte to another through the gap junctions. So they don't need, the important thing here is that each cardiomyocyte doesn't need to receive the signal from an orthorhythmic cell because they are in close proximity to each other, so they will stimulate each other in unison through these gap junctions. So the movement of sodium and potassium to activate, and the movement of calcium to activate the muscle contraction is propagated through the gap junctions. So the orthorhythmic cell delivers the action potentials to the gap junctions. which carries the excitation to the cardiac muscle cell. So the cardiac muscle cells, these mechanical cardiomyocytes, talk to each other through the gap junctions. And this allows them to contract at the same time. So each of them doesn't receive an electrical signal. They talk to each other so that they contract at the same time, so that all the cardiomyocytes that make the one atrium, the left atrium, will contract at the same time, or the left ventricle, they all will contract at the same time because they communicate with each other through the gap junctions. So just to finish, this will be my last slide for today. So what are some of the properties of cardiac myocytes that make them different from the skeletal muscle? First, they contract fast and continuously. You know, you don't want your heart muscle to stop. It's beating from embryonic age continuously without you having to regulate it or control it. It's under involuntary control, and it contracts and relaxes continuously because of the pacemaker cells. So here is a little bit fast, a heartbeat 75 times per minute. The ATP is mostly aerobically. It's not like in the skeletal muscle that you can have one or other. It's orthorhythmic, so it doesn't need the stimulus from a motor neuron. It comes from the pacemaker cells. It's orthorhythmic. It has a long refractory period. Remember what the refractory period is. The refractory period is the time window where the cell can no longer respond to a stimulus. And why does it have to be longer in cardiac, in the heart? Because you don't want the cardiomyocytes to respond to a stimulus very quickly, because that wouldn't allow the ventricle or the atria to fill completely. They would just contract, relax, contract. So you want them to be relaxed enough time to fill up with blood. So this is incredible. And then, although I'm saying that the mechanical cardiomyocytes, that there's orthorhythmicity in cardiac muscle stimulation, but they can still be regulated by neurons, by the peripheral nervous system. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So someone was talking about anxiety, that the heart starts beating. So that anxiety activates the sympathetic nervous system. And it's the sympathetic nervous system that now increases the heartbeat. It's also regulated by hormones produced by the pituitary, adrenal glands, kidney, heart. All these glands secrete hormones that can regulate the heartbeat. So it's orthorhythmic, so it's pumping by itself. It doesn't need to be stimulated by neurons, but it is regulated by neurons and by glands. Okay, so I think that's it. So today's Thursday. So don't forget, a week from today you have exam. So the lecture for the material for the exam is already posted. So we have still one lecture on Tuesday. But remember, that material, you have to learn that material for Thursday. So try to study it over the weekend. Okay? So any questions? So the smooth muscle is also very interesting. So these slides, I didn't finish the whole lecture because there's so many questions, but they're so interesting. I think it's really worthwhile. But study this. We'll go over this in on Tuesday. Okay, so have a good weekend and please study hard. And remember, make sure that your computer is working for the exam. Will there be a review? Okay, so when should I have the review? Wednesday? Can you make a suggestion? Because Tuesday we still have class, right? So Wednesday, what time on Wednesday? Any suggestions? Like 8 a.m. before people go to work, 8 p.m., 10 a.m. It cannot be 10 a.m. because some people are working and there are classes. So same time as class on Wednesday. So we don't have lecture on Wednesdays. So I can only think about it of having a review session like at 7:30 a.m. on Wednesday. We cannot do it 4 p.m. We can, because there's people work and there's classes. Remember, Wednesday there are labs all day, morning, afternoon, and evening. I'm not going to record it because if I record it, nobody will show up because you're relying on the recording, right? So what's the point? So what we can do is, let's see, Tuesday. Well, there's class, there's lab right after class. So I don't know. Tuesday after class, there's some students that have labs after class. So, I mean, I could try to do some review after class, and it's going to be recorded, and we will see how many people will stay. So I think we will have the review on Tuesday after class. We will just continue the Zoom. And those students that have to go to lab, they can hear the recording. So I think that's what I will do. Okay? Okay, goodbye, everybody. Have a good weekend.